I knew something was wrong before I even opened the back door. You ever wake up and the air just feels off somehow, like your brain notices trouble before your eyes do? That was me that morning. I smelled burnt plastic and wetwood before I saw the smoke, and by the time I stepped onto the porch with my coffee still in my hand, there was already this thin gray line climbing into the sky behind the tree line on the west side of my property. At first I figured maybe one of the contractors up on the ridge was burning scrap again, because those guys treated county regulations more like suggestions than laws. But then the wind shifted and I caught that smell. Old pine beams, oil, paint thinner, all the stuff I kept in my storage shed. My stomach dropped so hard I swear I almost threw up right there on the porch. I took off running without even putting shoes on, just sprinted through wet grass and gravel like an idiot while coffee splashed down my arm. By the time I reached the clearing, there wasn't much left to save. The whole shed had collapsed inward like somebody stomped the center out of it. Roof panels were twisted up like potato chips, sparks still crackling underneath the debris, and ash floated around so slow and quiet it almost looked peaceful, which honestly made me even angrier. That shed had been there longer than I had. My dad built it back in the late 70s with wood he salvaged from an old church renovation outside Millhaven County. Every dent in those walls had a story attached to it. Fishing gear, busted lawnmowers, old Christmas decorations my mom refused to throw out before she passed. It wasn't just storage, you know? It was one of those places that quietly becomes part of your life until you can't imagine the property without it. And standing about 20 feet away from the ashes were 4 men wearing bright silver jackets with the Blackthorn Development logo stitched across the chest, just staring uphill toward those brand new luxury apartment towers they'd been building all year. I recognized one of them immediately, this guy named Darren Pike, site supervisor, late 30s maybe, perfect haircut, expensive sunglasses, always talked like he was pitching a timeshare even when he was apologizing. He noticed me coming, and suddenly everybody got real uncomfortable. One guy pretended to check his phone. Another started kicking dirt over embers with his boot like that was somehow helping now. What the hell happened? I yelled, probably louder than I meant to. Darren raised both hands real calm, like I was the unreasonable one. Sir, we believe the structure was abandoned. There was a scheduled removal this morning tied to site optimization. Site optimization. I still remember that phrase because it sounded so absurd standing there looking at 40 years of my family's life turned into smoke. You burned down my shed for a better view? No, it was a controlled removal, he said, way too fast. Unfortunately, the fire spread more aggressively than anticipated. I actually laughed when he said that, not because it was funny, but because I genuinely couldn't believe a human being could stand there and say something that stupid with a straight face. Aggressively than anticipated? I said, man, I was in there last night fixing a damn door hinge. That made him pause for half a second, just enough for me to realize they hadn't checked anything. No records, no permits, no ownership verification, nothing. Somebody high up at Blackthorn decided my shed blocked the skyline view from their overpriced glass apartments, and instead of handling it legally, they just erased it. Now here's the part that really got under my skin. About 6 months before all this happened, Blackthorn had started buying up land around the ridge. Old farms mostly. Elderly folks, retired couples, families that had been there forever. They came in promising economic revitalization and modern housing opportunities, all that polished corporate nonsense. Some people sold because taxes kept climbing. Some fought it. My neighbor Walt Jensen used to joke that Blackthorn developers walked around town like they already owned the sunlight too. At the time I laughed. Standing there in the ashes of my father's shed, I realized maybe he wasn't joking. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat out in a lawn chair near the burned foundation until almost midnight just staring up at those apartment towers glowing on the hill. Huge glass balconies, rooftop fire pits, fancy mood lighting. Looked like a damn spaceship landed above our county. And the worst part was they did have a perfect view now. Clean lines straight across the valley, no old shed in the way anymore. I remember thinking how strange it was that rich people will spend millions trying to make a place feel authentic while destroying the actual people who made it real in the first place. Then around 1 in the morning, I remembered something my Uncle Ray told me years earlier during a property dispute over flood drainage. Ray used to work county inspections before retiring, and he always said developers never fear angry homeowners. They fear paperwork. Specifically, environmental compliance paperwork. And suddenly, sitting there smelling smoke still lingering in the dirt, I remembered my shed had been listed in one of the original land surveys because of wildfire buffer regulations tied to the ridge development. That was the moment the whole thing changed. The next morning, I drove straight to my Uncle Ray's place before the sun even came up all the way. Ray lived about 20 minutes outside Millhaven in this little weathered farmhouse with wind chimes hanging off the porch and 3 half-dead trucks parked in the yard that he swore he was gonna fix someday. He opened the door wearing sweatpants and holding a bowl of cereal, looked at my face for maybe 2 seconds, then said, "Somebody die, or you finally snap and kill one of those condo people?" That was Ray. No warm-up conversation ever. I told him what happened while he dug through file cabinets in his garage office. The more I talked, the quieter he got, and trust me, when Ray got quiet, people usually got nervous. He finally pulled out this thick folder full of county survey maps and slapped it down on the table hard enough to shake dust loose. "There," he said, stabbing a finger at one page. I knew I remembered that structure. My shed wasn't just marked on the survey. It was specifically identified as a pre-existing rural utility structure protected under the wildfire mitigation layout approved for the Blackthorn development. The entire apartment project had been granted conditional approval based on maintaining certain fire separation distances between the ridge and existing structures below it. My shed literally helped qualify their permit. I just stared at the paperwork for a second. So if they destroyed it, Ray leaned back in his chair, then technically they altered a protected compliance condition without county approval. Then he smiled a little, which is real bad. Now look, I'm not some mastermind revenge guy. I fix fences for a living. Half the time I forget my own passwords. But even I understood one thing in that moment. These people hadn't just burned my shed. They'd accidentally pulled a thread connected to their entire project. By noon, I was sitting in the county municipal office with a copy of the fire department incident report, old tax records, survey documents, and about 15 years' worth of photos showing the shed clearly existed and was actively used. The woman at the front desk, Denise, knew me because small towns are like that. She took one look at the paperwork stack and said, "Oh boy, who pissed you off?" "Blackthorn," I said. She actually winced. That should tell you everything right there. Apparently Blackthorn had already rubbed half the county the wrong way. Complaints about drainage runoff, noise violations, trucks blocking roads at 5 in the morning. But they had expensive lawyers and deep pockets, so most people figured nothing would ever stick. Still, Denise carried the paperwork into the back office personally, and about 10 minutes later this county inspector, named Martin Hale, came out asking if I had time to answer a few questions. 3 hours later, he was still asking questions. The thing about experienced inspectors is they know when someone's lying before the liar even finishes the sentence. And according to Martin, Blackthorn's explanation for the fire changed 3 times in one afternoon. First, it was accidental ignition during debris clearing. Then it became controlled demolition. Then suddenly they claimed they believed the structure sat partially on development land, which was complete nonsense because property markers were clearly visible. "They're panicking," Martin told me quietly after one phone call. "That's usually when people start making mistakes." 2 days later, the county issued a temporary stop work order while they reviewed compliance documentation. You would have thought somebody shut off oxygen to the whole ridge. Construction froze instantly. Cranes stopped moving. Cement trucks got turned away at the gate. Guys in hard hats stood around smoking cigarettes and looking confused while managers barked into phones nonstop. I drove past the site that Friday and saw Darren Pike arguing with 2 men in suits so aggressively one of them nearly dropped a tablet over the railing. And honestly, I should have felt satisfied by then. But I didn't. Not yet. Because the more investigators looked, the uglier things got. See, once the county starts digging through your permits, they don't stop at one issue. They start checking everything. Fire exits, drainage plans, material substitutions, emergency access roads. And according to Ray, developers sometimes gamble on the assumption nobody will ever look too closely once construction gets rolling, because delays cost counties money too. Turns out Blackthorn had been gambling a lot. Within 3 weeks, inspectors found unauthorized retaining wall changes near the North Tower, cheaper fire-resistant materials swapped out without approval, and a stormwater runoff issue that had already started contaminating part of Miller Creek after heavy rain. That creek runs behind 3 residential properties, including mine. which meant suddenly state environmental agencies got involved too. That's when things really spiraled. Local news stations started showing up outside the construction gates. Buyers who'd already paid deposits for luxury units started demanding answers. Somebody leaked internal emails online where Blackthorn executives joked about rural resistance slowing progress. One executive literally called local homeowners temporary obstacles with mailboxes. You can imagine how well that went over around here. The funniest part? Darren Pike, Mr. Site Optimization himself, suddenly became impossible to reach. No more polished confidence. No more rehearsed corporate smile. Rumor was Blackthorn suspended him internally while legal teams scrambled to contain the damage. Then one afternoon about a month after the fire, I got a knock at my door. Two men stood on the porch wearing expensive Navy suits that probably cost more than my truck. One introduced himself as Gavin Mercer, lead counsel for Blackthorn Development. The other guy never spoke once, just carried a leather folder and looked miserable. "Mr. Callahan," Gavin said smoothly, "we're hoping to resolve this matter amicably." I almost laughed hearing the word amicably while standing in front of my half-burned property. He asked if we could talk privately, so we sat outside near the old oak tree by the driveway. And I'll give the guy credit. He knew exactly how to sound sympathetic without technically admitting fault. "An unfortunate series of misunderstandings occurred," he said carefully. "Our company would like to offer compensation for the damaged structure and assist in rebuilding efforts." "Damaged?" I said. "You people turned it into ash." His jaw tightened just a little. Tiny crack in the mask. Then he opened the folder. "They offered me $80,000 up front, full reconstruction of a larger storage building, landscaping improvements, and a confidentiality agreement that basically required me to stop cooperating publicly with investigators." That last part told me everything. They weren't trying to fix a mistake anymore. They were trying to stop a collapse. I asked Gavin one question. "How much money are you losing every day construction stays shut down?" For the first time since arriving, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. That information isn't relevant, which meant it was extremely relevant. I leaned back in my chair and looked up toward the ridge where those luxury towers sat unfinished against the evening sky. Empty window frames, exposed concrete, silent cranes, all frozen because somebody thought an old man's shed didn't matter. "You know what the crazy part is?" I told him. "If your people had just knocked on my door 6 weeks ago, we probably could have worked something out." Neither man said anything, because we all knew it was true. Instead, they treated the whole community like background scenery, something to move around until the view looked prettier. Then Gavin tried one more angle. "Mr. Callahan, between us, these projects bring jobs, tax revenue, investment. Sometimes compromise is necessary for progress." I remember smiling at that because it sounded exactly like the kind of sentence someone practices in a mirror before saying it to people whose lives they're about to bulldoze. "Funny thing about progress," I said. "Everybody talks about it like regular folks are supposed to be grateful while getting shoved out of the picture." The conversation ended about 5 minutes later, and before leaving, Gavin handed me his card. "Please think carefully before escalating further." That line sat with me all night. Not because it scared me, because it sounded an awful lot like a threat. And that's when I decided I was done playing defense. The next week was when everything finally blew apart. Up until then, Blackthorn still had a chance to contain the damage. Expensive companies survive scandals all the time. They stall, settle quietly, blame a middle manager, wait for people to get distracted. That probably would have worked too, if they hadn't underestimated how angry this town already was before my shed burned down. Once folks realized the county investigation might actually stick, people started talking. And I mean really talking. Old complaints came crawling out of everywhere. Farmers showed up with photos of cracked well systems after blasting work near the ridge. A retired schoolteacher named Linda Mercer claimed Blackthorn trucks damaged her property wall and ignored her for months. Even Walt Jensen, my neighbor who used to joke about developers owning sunlight, brought forward emails showing Blackthorn representatives pressured several elderly homeowners into rush sales by implying future zoning changes would tank property values. Suddenly, this wasn't about one burned shed anymore. It became about years of resentment nobody thought mattered. The county held a public hearing about 6 weeks after the fire, and I swear I've never seen the municipal building so packed before. People lined the walls holding folders, photos, handwritten notes. Half the room looked furious, The other half looked terrified property values were about to collapse if the project died. That's the thing nobody tells you about these situations. Even when there's a clear villain, people still get divided once money gets involved. I remember walking into that hearing and spotting Darren Pike sitting near the front beside Blackthorn's attorneys. First time I'd seen him since the fire. He looked rough, pale, exhausted, tie hanging crooked. The kind of face people get when they stop sleeping properly. For a second, I almost felt bad for him. Then I remembered standing barefoot in ashes while he explained aggressive fire spread to me like I was stupid. The hearing lasted nearly 4 hours. Inspectors presented compliance violations. Environmental officials discussed runoff contamination. Residents shared complaints. Then Martin Hale took the floor and laid out the timeline surrounding the destruction of my shed. And man, you could feel the whole room shift. Because once all the paperwork got projected onto those screens together, it stopped sounding like an accident and started sounding like negligence wrapped in arrogance. At one point, a county commissioner asked directly whether Blackthorn knowingly altered a protected wildfire compliance structure without authorization. Nobody from their legal team answered immediately. That silence said more than any statement ever could. Then Darren did something nobody expected. He stood up. You could actually hear chairs creak because the whole room turned toward him at once. His attorney grabbed his sleeve trying to stop him, but Darren pulled away and walked to the microphone looking like a guy marching toward his own execution. And this part still messes with me sometimes because I honestly don't know whether he was brave or just broken by then. He admitted the company knew my shed wasn't abandoned. Not only that, internal discussions had happened weeks earlier about visual obstructions affecting premium unit marketing along the west-facing side of the development. Emails were read aloud right there in the hearing room. One executive suggested the structure made the Valley View look economically depressed. Another called it a rural eyesore visible from luxury inventory. Then came the worst part. Darren admitted the fire was never supposed to happen at all. According to him, supervisors authorized a demolition crew to remove part of the structure before county review, assuming they could handle permits afterward through legal channels. But workers used cutting torches during high wind conditions. Sparks caught old insulation inside the walls, and within minutes the entire shed ignited. Complete incompetence. Complete arrogance. And somehow even worse than if they'd burned it intentionally. The room exploded after that. People yelling, reporters rushing outside to file updates, county officials trying to regain order. One older guy near the back shouted, "You people think this town belongs to you." And honestly, judging by the applause afterward, a lot of folks agreed with him. Blackthorn stock dropped hard over the next month. Construction remained suspended indefinitely. Multiple investors backed out. Lawsuits piled up from buyers, contractors, even former employees. Last I heard, the company quietly sold off most of the unfinished development to another investment group out of Denver. And me? Well, eventually Blackthorn settled. They rebuilt the shed completely using fireproof materials just like I demanded. Metal roof, reinforced concrete base, upgraded electrical work, better than the original in every practical way. They paid financial damages too, enough that I finally fixed the leaking roof on my house and replaced my truck transmission without checking my bank account first. But weirdly enough, none of that felt like the real ending. The real ending happened one evening about 3 months later. I was sitting outside the new shed drinking a beer around sunset when Darren Pike pulled into my driveway alone. No lawyers, no corporate people, just him. He looked smaller somehow without the expensive jacket and polished attitude. More human. "I got fired," he said before I could even ask why he was there. I nodded once. Didn't really know what else to say. Then he surprised me. "I should have stopped it," he said quietly. I knew they were pushing too hard. For a minute, neither of us talked. Just sat there listening to crickets and distant construction noise from somewhere across the valley. Finally, he looked over at the new shed. Hell of a lot of damage over one view. And I remember thinking about that sentence long after he left. Because the truth is, he wasn't entirely wrong. See, people online later turned the whole thing into this big revenge story. Guy beats greedy developers. Justice wins. Everybody cheers. But real life's messier than that. Some local workers lost jobs when the project froze. Small businesses lost contracts. Property disputes around town got uglier. Neighbors started arguing over development at city meetings like we were suddenly on opposite teams. Even now, some people think I did the right thing. Others think I burned down an entire project over a shed. Maybe both are true. But I'll say this. If your version of progress requires treating ordinary people like obstacles instead of human beings, eventually somebody's going to push back. And when they do, the damage usually spreads a whole lot farther than expected. So tell me honestly down in the comments. If you were in my position, would you have stopped after the apology and payout, or would you have done exactly what I did and watched the whole thing collapse? And do you think Blackthorn got what they deserved? Or did an entire town end up paying for one company's arrogance? If this story got under your skin even a little, hit like, subscribe, and stick around. Because out here, the ugliest battles usually start with something people in power think nobody will notice.